December 1942, 28,000 feet above Tunisia. Captain Jack Ilfrey shoved the yoke of his P-38 Lightning forward and felt the twin-boom fighter surge into a steep dive. A German Bf-109F flashed beneath him, rolling away toward cloud cover. Ilfrey pushed harder. The fighter responded, then shuddered violently. A low moan vibrated through the cockpit. Control surfaces stiffened. Speed climbed. 380 miles per hour. 420. 450. Then it hit. The yoke froze solid. The Lightning bucked like a live animal, its tail seemingly flexing out of rhythm with the nose. Ilfrey tried to pull out, but the yoke refused to budge. His airspeed indicator jumped toward the red line. Here we go. I'm done. The P-38 entered compressibility, an aerodynamic phenomenon no one fully understood yet. Airflow around the wing reached transonic speeds, generating shockwaves that locked the controls and forced the aircraft downward, nose-heavy, uncontrollable. Many Lightning pilots had already died this way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ilfrey braced for impact. At the last second, maybe instinct, maybe luck, he chopped the throttles and deployed the dive flaps, a trick some pilots used even though it wasn't actually approved. The aircraft's nose gradually rose. The shuddering eased. At 12,000 feet, Ilfrey yanked back with all his strength and leveled out, panting into his mask. He survived. But dozens of others wouldn't. And by early 1943, the P-38 Lightning, America's fastest, longest-range, most advanced fighter, was at risk of being withdrawn from European combat entirely. The Air Corps had no idea how to fix the dive problem. Lockheed engineers were baffled. The pilots were terrified. But one man, an engineer so junior his reports weren't even read, the first 2 times he submitted them, believed he had found a solution, a simple trick. A stupid trick, according to his colleagues. A trick that would one day let P-38 Lightnings hit 600 miles per hour in a controlled dive, the first American fighters capable of doing it without killing their pilots. His name was Benjamin Kelsey, and he was about to change the war. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning went into combat with mythic expectations: twin engines, twin booms, counter-rotating propellers, top speed, 400 miles per hour. Range, unmatched. Climb rate, spectacular. It looked like something out of a science fiction comic. But its greatest promise, the ability to dive faster than any fighter on Earth, turned out to be its deadliest flaw. During early flight tests in 1941-42, a few Lockheed test pilots reported strange vibrations in steep dives. The yoke became heavy. Trim didn't respond. The nose seemed glued downward. The Air Corps brushed off these complaints at first. But when P-38 seconds arrived in Britain in 1942 and began escorting bombers into occupied France, reports flooded headquarters. Controls locked completely at high speed. Unable to recover from dive unless altitude above 10,000 feet. Left aircraft in full dive until death. One squadron commander wrote bluntly, "My men are more afraid of the Lightning than the Luftwaffe." And he wasn't wrong. By late 1942, German pilots learned a devastating trick: simply dive away. Their Bf-109 seconds and FIO-190 seconds could pull up safely around 450–480 miles per hour. The P-38 pilot chasing them? He risked losing control entirely. American crews watched helplessly. An enemy fighter dove. The P-38 followed. The P-38 vanished into a cloud deck or haze and never came back up. Pilots called it the dive demon. Lockheed engineers tried everything: adjusting tail incidence, reinforcing elevator linkages, changing trim tab geometry, limiting allowable dive angles. None of it worked. Something happened to the air around the wing, something no one understood in 1942. Today we call it transonic, shock formation. Back then, they called it a curse. Ben Kelsey was 34 years old, a mild-mannered aeronautical engineer with experience flying fighters himself. He'd been part of the original P-38 development program years earlier. But by 1943, he wasn't assigned to propeller design, aerodynamics, or controls. He wasn't even technically on the P-38 team anymore, yet he remained obsessed with the Lightning's dive problem. One night, late in February 1943, he sat at his desk, staring at draft after draft of test data. Elevator authority collapsed above Mach 0.68. Tailplane oscillations grew with speed. Aft fuselage buffeted violently. Shockwave visualized, forming at mid-chord of wing. Kelsey leaned back. Everyone else assumed the issue was the tail. Diving shockwaves disrupted airflow to the elevator, rendering it useless. But Kelsey wondered, what if the problem isn't the tail? What if the shockwave is forming too far back along the wing? What if the wing is forcing the tail into a dead zone of turbulent air? He grabbed a pencil and sketched a crude side view of the P-38. Wing shockwave tail. If the shockwave hit the tailplane at a certain point, the tail basically stopped working like a boat rudder lifted out of the water. Move the shockwave forward or backward, and the tail works again. So what could move it? In theory, adjusting lift distribution, but that would require redesigning the entire wing. Impossible mid-war. Kelsey slammed his pencil on the table, then froze. Unless, what if I changed the local airflow instead of the whole wing? He stared at the sketch. The wing shockwave formed because the aircraft's center of pressure moved aft at high speed, creating a nose-down pitch moment. Pilots couldn't counteract that with elevators alone. But what if the elevator had help? What if something on the underside of the wing, something tiny, could generate just enough lift at high speed to compensate? A small flap, not a full dive, brake. Not a major control surface, just a flap that slightly changed the local pressure. Something simple. Something stupid, he scribbled. Add small downward deflecting flaps under wing roots to increase local lift in high-speed dive. He calculated forces, then recalculated, then ran the numbers again. If the flaps extended at the right angle about 35 degrees, the resulting pressure change would slightly shift the shockwave backward, restoring elevator authority. Just enough, it would not slow the aircraft. It would not disrupt stability at lower speeds. It would not require structural redesign. But few engineers believed such a tiny flap could affect transonic airflow. Kelsey told a colleague enthusiastically the next morning. The man laughed. "Ben, that's stupid. The flap is too small to matter." Kelsey typed up the idea anyway. He titled the memo, "Proposal for Auxiliary Dive Acceleration Flap P-38 Lightning." He sent it up the chain. It was ignored. He sent a second copy. Ignored. He sent a third copy directly to Hall Hibbard, Lockheed's chief engineer. Hibbard read it. Looked up. This is simple enough that it might actually work. The dive flap prototype was crude, barely more than 2 small rectangular panels bolted to the underside of each wing. It was not elegant. It looked like an afterthought, but it deflected airflow exactly how Kelsey predicted. On June 20th, 1943, Lockheed test pilot Milo Burcham climbed into a modified P-38 for the first trial. He eased the Lightning to 20,000 feet. The test controller radioed, "Begin dive when ready." Burcham pushed the nose down. Speed, 350 miles per hour. 400. 450. The same vibrations started. The aircraft trembled. The yoke began to stiffen. Speed, 470. 480. Burcham flipped the new dive flap switch. Kelsey watched from the ground, fists clenched. Inside the cockpit, everything changed instantly. The shuddering eased. The tail stopped vibrating. The yoke loosened, slightly. Burcham pulled back. The P-38 obeyed. He leveled out safely. The radio crackled. "Lockheed, this is Burcham. Gentlemen." "It works." Kelsey exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The dive flap had proven itself. But Lockheed didn't realize what it had really unlocked, because the next test dive would be the one that shocked the entire Air Corps. 2 weeks later, Lockheed authorized a dramatic test, a full-power, full-angle dive from 32,000 feet. This time, no one was sure the aircraft could survive. Bertram climbed to altitude, turned toward open desert, and pushed the nose down into a steep dive. The lightning dropped like a stone. Speed climbed frighteningly fast. 500 miles per hour, 520 miles per hour, 550 miles per hour. The aircraft howled, the sound of air slamming into metal at near supersonic velocity. Bertram triggered the dive flaps. And the P-38 settled. Still diving. Still accelerating, but stable. Altitude, 17,000 feet. Speed, 575 miles per hour, the fastest controlled dive in American aviation history. Bertram pulled back gently on the yoke. The lightning rose smoothly, as though nothing unusual had happened. He radioed in, "We're past 570 miles per hour. Could have gone further." On the ground, the engineers erupted in celebration. The stupid trick wasn't stupid at all. It was genius. And it meant something devastating for the Luftwaffe. German fighters could no longer escape by diving. When Kelsey presented results to the Army Air Forces, reactions split into 2 camps. Camp 1. "We need this immediately." Commanders whose pilots had died in dives demanded immediate production. Camp 2. "Too risky, not proven, too expensive." Conservative engineers feared introducing a new control system, however small, into a frontline fighter. The argument dragged on for weeks. Meanwhile, pilots kept dying. One squadron lost 3 men in a single week, all to unrecoverable dives. Finally, General Hugh Knurr pounded the conference table and barked, "Install the goddamn things. Every lightning. Immediately." Production ramped up. Dive flap kits were boxed, crated, and shipped across the Atlantic. By November 1943, the first units in England received retrofitted aircraft. Pilots took them into the sky with caution. But after the first few dives, opinions changed instantly. One pilot wrote, "It feels like a different aircraft. The demon is gone." Another, "A German dives now? He dies now." But no one yet understood just how far the new dive capability could be pushed. No one except Kelsey. And the test pilots. They had already taken the Lightning past 600 miles per hour, full weight, full load, full control. Now it was time to take that capability into combat. Over northern Italy, Captain Robin Olds of the 434th Fighter Squadron spotted 3 Bf-109 seconds diving away. Before the modification, the Americans would have been forced to break off. Not this time. Olds pushed his throttles forward and dove. 500 miles per hour. 550. Nearly 580. The 109 pilots glanced back and saw something they had never witnessed. A P-38 closing on them in a dive. Olds' wingman later said, "They panicked. They'd never seen a Lightning do that. The Germans tried to pull out. Olds stayed on them. One overshot his recovery and snapped into a spin. Another tried to zoom climb. Olds shot him in the belly. The third rolled low but failed to escape. 3 kills, 0 losses. Word spread across the Luftwaffe. The American twin-tail can follow dives now. But they underestimated it. The P-38 wasn't following dives. It was out-diving everything. Before the dive flap, the P-38 was fast long range, deadly at altitude, vulnerable in steep dives. After the modification, it became something else entirely. A vertical maneuver predator. A true boom and zoom machine. A 600 miles per hour sword falling from the stratosphere. American aces Bong, Maguire, Johnson began pushing deeper and deeper into enemy formations, attacking with dives that would have killed them a year earlier. German pilots soon wrote in their combat reports, "The American twin-boom fighter is impossible to escape from in a dive. The P-38 can now exceed speeds we cannot match." Avoid vertical combat with lightning fighters. But by then, it was too late. After months of disaster and dozens of dead pilots, the P-38 had finally become what Lockheed always intended, the fastest diving fighter in the world. And the man responsible, the quiet engineer with the stupid idea, had just rewritten aerial combat. July 7th, 1944, Northern Saipan. Just before dawn, Corporal Daniel Harker woke to the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against rock. At first, in the fog between sleep and alertness, he thought the noise came from inside the marine perimeter, maybe a mess crew dragging ammunition crates or an engineer detachment shifting a 55-gallon drum. But when he sat up in his shallow foxhole and felt the cool pre-dawn air on his face, he knew. The sound wasn't from behind them. It was in front. Somewhere beyond the line of broken palms, deep inside the shadows of the ravine where the Japanese 43rd Infantry Regiment had vanished the day before, steel was being dragged across stone, bayonets being fixed, sword scabbards tapping against knee plates, mortar bases dragged into place, thousands of men preparing to die, and thousands more preparing to kill. He nudged Private First Class Luis Ortega, curled beneath a poncho liner beside him. "Wake up," Harker whispered. "The jungle's moving." Ortega blinked, listening. At first he heard nothing but wind swirling through shattered breadfruit trees and the faint, methodical clink of Marines checking magazines along the foxhole line. Then the jungle exhaled. A single yell, high, desperate, almost inhuman, echoed across the ravine, followed by 100 more, then 1,000. "Banza! Ai! The scream rolled across the valley like the breath of a waking volcano. Every Marine on the ridge stiffened, rifles lifted, machine gun crews braced, radio operators slammed fresh batteries into their handsets. The smell of fear and cordite laced the air. The Japanese were coming. But this time, Harker thought, we're ready for them. At the top of the ridge, Lieutenant Jack Merrill, lean, sharp-eyed, and running on 20 minutes of sleep, pressed the throat mic against his collarbone and spoke with iron calm. "Battery able. This is Red Dog 6. Confirm on station?" Static. Then a reply. "Red Dog 6. This is battery able. All tubes loaded. Give us the mark. Stand by. Infantry line is set. Targets will be hot in 10 seconds. Harker heard Merrill's next words not through the radio but as a shout. "Flare!" The first flare hissed up from the center of the ridgeline. It arced into the sky, exploded into brilliant white light, and for a moment the entire ravine lit up like noon in July. What the Marines saw would stay with them for life. The ravine was moving. 10,000 Japanese soldiers, infantry, support troops, naval gunners, medics with rifles tied to their backs, wounded, pulled on litters, were charging uphill in a single tidal wave of bodies. Officers with katanas, sappers carrying bamboo pole bombs, machine gun crews rushing with ammunition dangling from their necks, a sea of uniforms, helmets, flags, and screaming faces. Ortega swallowed once. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Harker clicked safety off. "Hold," he murmured. "Hold." Merrill's voice cracked across the ridge. "Battery-able fire for effect. Fire, fire, fire." The first 105mm howitzer rounds landed in the center of the Japanese wave. They didn't just explode, they sculpted the air. Shockwaves flattened grass and shattered tree trunks. Fireballs tore gaping holes into the mass of bodies surging forward. Screams rose and were swallowed by the next shell, and then the next, until the hillside looked like it was being punched by invisible gods. Harker felt the detonations rattle in his ribs. "Those boys are dialed in tight," he muttered, almost reverently. Battery Able was 2 miles behind the marine line, dug into a coconut plantation near Charan Kanoa. Merrill had spent the previous afternoon crawling up and down the ridge with binoculars, memorizing distances, slopes, and fallback ranges. He'd drawn firing tables in pencil on the back of a K-ration box. Now those numbers were turning into hell. Shell after shell slammed into the charging Japanese. Bodies flew. Machine gun crews disappeared into geysers of dirt and smoke. Litters carrying wounded soldiers flipped into the air like feathers. Yet the charge did not stop. If anything, it grew louder. More flares streaked into the sky. More Marines opened fire. BARs chattered. M1 Garrons cracked in precise methodical rhythm. Browning, 30 cals spat blazing lines into the smoke. But the banzai wave kept climbing. Harker fired 3 quick rounds into a group of Japanese soldiers sprinting toward a break in the ridge line. 1 fell. 2 kept running. "Reload!" Ortega shouted, tossing a fresh clip. "Thanks!" The Marines fought like men bailing water from a sinking ship, knowing every second counted but aware the flood could drown them at any moment. At the far right of the Marine line, just past a cluster of volcanic rock formations, the Japanese found a weak point. One platoon, only 30 Marines, held a shallow saddle of land where the ridge dipped down toward the ravine. It was the only place the Japanese didn't have to climb straight up. The enemy hit it like a hammer. Harker heard the screams before he saw them. "Right flank!" Merrill yelled. "They're breaching on the right!" Without waiting for orders, Harker and Ortega sprinted along the ridge, half stumbling over foxholes, empty ammo crates, and wounded men crawling for cover. Machine gun fire stitched the air overhead. As they reached the saddle, a Japanese sergeant crashed over the rim of the ridge, helmet cracked, uniform torn, eyes wild. He swung his Arisaka rifle like a club. Ortega fired first, dropping him, but 3 more soldiers surged up behind the body. Then 5. The Marines in the saddle fell back, step by step, firing point-blank into faces, helmets, chests. A Japanese officer leaped into the nearest foxhole, his sword flashing as he slashed a Marine across the neck. "Keep them from spilling over," Merrill bellowed. Harker slammed himself into a firing position behind a blown-out tree stump and fired until the rifle clanged empty. Ortega grabbed a discarded BAR and stitched a line of fire across the next wave of attackers, the muzzle glowing orange. "Battery able! Shift fire!" Merrill roared into the throat mic. "Grid Charlie 2-5. Danger close repeat. Danger close drop 200. The radio operator's hands shook as he repeated the request. "Battery able," responded instantly. The next volley landed less than 80 yards from the Marine front line. The earth convulsed. A wall of smoke and shredded coral erupted upward. Harker felt the heat of the blast on his face. The Japanese on the right flank vanished beneath the barrage, vaporized, shredded, or blown down the ridge like leaves. "Beautiful sons of bitches," Harker muttered. The breach closed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the charge wasn't over. The Japanese commander, General Saito himself, had committed every reserve unit for this attack. Half his men were already dead or wounded, but he would not die without shattering the American line. The second wave emerged through the settling smoke, howling, firing wildly, tripping over bodies, stepping into craters still glowing from white-hot shrapnel. Among them ran medics holding rifles, cooks carrying, grenades, and wounded men limping on makeshift splints. A drummer boy, a teenager no older than 16, beat a rhythm on a half-destroyed taiko drum as he ran. Ortega saw him and hesitated. "Kid." The boy kept running. A shell burst 50 yards behind him and threw him forward, motionless. Ortega looked away. "Keep firing," Harker said quietly. Merrill knew the Japanese charge, as massive as it was, would eventually lose momentum. But the Marines were running out of ammunition at a terrifying rate, and he needed every artillery tube on the island hammering the ravine. He clicked his radio. "Red Dog 6 to all stations, any gun that can fire, fire. If you've got a tube and a reason to live, I want it throwing steel." A different voice came over the channel, Captain Rowland of Battery Charlie, miles south. "We're already engaged, Lieutenant. What's your fire mission?" "Everything you've got. All guns. Fire on my mark." "Where's the aiming point?" Merrill smiled grimly. Pick a Japanese soldier and aim at his damn shoelaces." A breath of silence. Then Roland laughed. "You got it, Red Dog 6. All guns on the shoelaces." Within 40 seconds, 24 more howitzers joined the barrage. The ridge shook like it was being struck by meteors. The Marines cheered. The Japanese wavered. And then they broke. Not all at once. Not even clearly. But the unstoppable wave suddenly became uneven, first slowing, then shrinking, then dissolving into pockets of wounded men crawling forward out of reflex and habit rather than hope. Harker lowered his rifle, chest heaving. Did we stop them?" Ortega spat into the dirt. "We stopped them from reaching hell. The rest is up to the corpsmen." But they both knew the truth. It wasn't over. Not yet. From the far left flank came a new sound, quieter than a battle cry, but sharper. A whistle. A Japanese officer emerged through drifting smoke, sword raised. Behind him, the remnants of 3 battalions surged in a desperate final push. Their screams were hoarse, weaker, but still defiant. "Banzai!" Merrill stood on the ridgeline, completely exposed, and pointed his carbine down the slope. "Mariners, finish it!" The line opened fire, every rifle, pistol, BAR, and machine gun firing at once. A solid wall of gunfire rolled down the hillside. The final Japanese assault shrank with every step. 30 yards away. 20. 15. A Japanese soldier with a grenade leaped forward, and a howitzer shell hit directly in front of him. The explosion erased the last charge, and with it, the battle. The screams faded. The gunfire dwindled. The smoke drifted away. Silence crept over the ridge like a slow, tentative tide. Harker collapsed into the dirt, his arms shaking too hard to reload. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," Ortega murmured. "That was a whole damn army." Merrill scanned the ravine through his binoculars. The entire valley was a tarning a ball, patchwork of smoking craters, shattered trees, and bodies, thousands of them. 10,000 men had tried to claw their way up the ridge. Almost none had made it. He exhaled once, slowly. "Artillery did it," he said aloud. "The guns saved us." He knew it wasn't just firepower. It was timing, positioning, coordination. The invisible math that made American artillery a deadly machine. The Japanese had fought with unimaginable bravery. But bravery wasn't enough. Not against steel, not against timing, not against the best artillery command system the modern world had yet built. As corpsmen moved along the line collecting wounded Marines, and as the surviving infantry slowly rebuilt fighting positions, Harker stood at the ridge's edge, staring down at the ravine. He had fought in Bougainville. He had fought at Tarawa. He thought he had seen everything. He had not. "Do you think they believed they could win?" Ortega asked quietly. Harker shook his head. "I think. They decided they didn't need to." Ortega swallowed. "Then why charge?" Harker didn't answer at first. He knew the Japanese had been ordered to die rather than surrender. He knew their officers had told them American Marines would torture prisoners. He knew General Saito had declared the entire garrison honor-bound to die for the Emperor. But none of that was the reason. He finally exhaled. "They charged," he said softly, "because they were soldiers. And soldiers don't pick the war they fight." Ortega nodded slowly. The sun finally rose above the ridge, casting gold across the battlefield. In the brightening light, Harker saw something move in the ravine. A single Japanese soldier, bleeding, staggering, stood up among the bodies. He raised his rifle as if to charge again. But he didn't. He saluted. Then he fell. Harker lowered his head. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the last one." But even as he spoke, Lieutenant Merrill approached with the latest reconnaissance notes. His face was tight, controlled. "We held the line," he said. "But this isn't the end." Harker frowned. "Sir? There are still pockets holding out in the caves," Merrill said. "Command says we'll be clearing them for days." Harker sighed. "Always another fight." Merrill placed a hand on his shoulder. "Yes. But tonight? Tonight you Marines did what armies aren't supposed to survive. He looked down into the ravine one last time. And you did it together. July 8th, 1944 Northern Saipan 0700 hours. The morning after the Banzai attack felt like waking inside someone else's nightmare. Corporal Daniel Harker moved through the shattered jungle with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a hollow tightness in his chest. The sun was warm. The sky was bright blue. Birds chirped from a distant copse of palms. None of it matched the ground beneath his boots. The ravine, where the Japanese had charged only hours earlier, was a posada, graveyard without boundaries. Bodies carpeted the slopes, sprawled across craters, slumped against blasted tree trunks. Japanese, Marines, civilians caught between armies. Smoke drifted from still smouldering shell impacts, and the air carried the thick, metallic sting of blood. Harker had seen death before. He'd fought at Cape Gloucester, where men disappeared into mud pits so deep they were never found. He'd fought at Tarawa, where the tide washed corpses back and forth like driftwood, but nothing matched this. 10,000 men had hurled themselves up the ridge. More than 2/3 were still where they fell. "Keep moving," Lieutenant Merrill said, stepping around a crater filled with water and shrapnel. "Watch your footing." He said it like one might warn men about tripping on roots during a hike. Ortega, walking behind Harker, muttered, "Lieutenant's got iron nerves." "Lieutenant's too tired to feel anything," Harker replied. Merrill glanced back. "You, too, doing commentary back there?" "No, sir," Harker said. "Good," Merrill answered. "Save your breath. We're not even at the caves yet." Word had come down from division headquarters an hour after sunrise. Surviving Japanese soldiers were retreating into the northern caves. They were to be cleared. All of them. The Marines had expected as much. Every island in the Pacific seemed to contain a labyrinth of tunnels and caverns where Japanese troops could hide, regroup, and counterattack. But Saipan's caves were something else entirely. Winding networks of volcanic tubes, some stretching dozens of yards deep, with 2 or 3 exits disguised by foliage, rocks, or cliffs. And worse, civilians were mixed in, women, children, elderly men, whole families who'd fled into the darkness during American naval bombardments. Some came out when called, but many stayed hidden, believing the same lies their soldiers believed, that capture meant torture. The Marines knew what that meant. Every cave was going to be a nightmare. The entrance looked like a jagged crack in a wall of blackened limestone. Charred roots hung from the rim like the tatters of some ancient carpet. Just inside the shadows, the temperature dropped sharply, as if the earth itself inhaled cold air from deep below. Sergeant Ray Dalton, the platoon's demolitions specialist, stepped forward with a satchel charge under one arm and a flashlight in the other. "All right," Dalton said. "Standard protocol. I call. They don't answer. We lob in a smoke grenade to flush out anyone willing to surrender. If that doesn't work, we throw a frag. If that doesn't work, Lieutenant gives the green light and we close it up." Ortega frowned. "Close it up with who inside?" Dalton didn't blink. "Whoever stays inside." Harker knew Dalton didn't enjoy saying it, but this was the Pacific. This was how the war was being fought. Dalton cupped his hands around his mouth. "Anata taki. Quat, Toride Sareta," he shouted in heavily accented Japanese. "You are surrounded." He waited. Silence. "Deti kite kudasai. Come out peacefully." A faint rustle came from deep inside the darkness. A scrape of stone. A whisper. Merrill held up a hand. "Stand by." The rustling grew louder. Something or someone was crawling toward the entrance. Dalton set down the charge and raised his Thompson. 2 shapes emerged, not soldiers. 2 civilian women, hands trembling, eyes wide with fear. A small child clung to one woman's kimono, buried in fabric smeared with dirt and dried blood. "Corpsman," Merrill called. "Take them back to the aid station." As the women were led away, Dalton exhaled. At least someone's listening today. Then, a rifle shot flashed from deep inside the cave. The round tore past Dalton's head and cracked into the stone above him. Down! Harker yelled, dragging Dalton by the collar. A burst of Arisaka fire followed. Bullets whined. Off rock. Merrill didn't hesitate. Frag it! Dalton pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds, and rolled the grenade inside. The explosion echoed like thunder ripping through a cathedral. Dust blew out of the entrance in a thick cloud. Harker braced himself. 4 Japanese soldiers stumbled out, one missing an arm, one with half his thigh gone, one crawling with a knife clutched in his teeth. The 4th still had enough strength to charge. He sprinted toward Merrill, bayonet forward. Harker fired once. The soldier collapsed mid-step. Silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of another demolition team blasting a different cave. Merrill kneeled next to the soldier's body, inspecting the wounds. Those weren't garrison troops, he said quietly. These were officers. Why were officers hiding in a hole? Ortega asked. Because their job was done, Merrill said, and they didn't want to die on the ridge. Harker understood the anger in his voice. Officers weren't supposed to hide behind wounded men, but war rewrites every rule men think they live by. They reached the second cave by midday. This one was deeper, much deeper. The entrance sloped down quickly, disappearing into pitch blackness. The smell wafting out was unmistakable. Sweat, mold, human waste, rotting food, gun oil, a stale heaviness that seemed to cling to the inside of the nose. No way, this one's empty, Dalton said. Merrill nodded. We're going in. The Marines formed a wedge. Merrill in front with a flashlight and carbine. Dalton behind him with a satchel charge. Harker and Ortega on the flanks with BAR and rifle. 2 more riflemen and a corpsman in the rear. They stepped into the cave. Dark swallowed them instantly. The air was cooler but thick with a suffocating humidity. Bats stirred overhead, fluttering deeper into the cavern. The beam of Merrill's flashlight drew shaky cones across jagged walls. Stay quiet, Merrill whispered. They moved deeper. 10 yards. 20. 30. The cave floor slanted downward into a wider chamber. Something glinted on the far wall. Sir, Harker whispered. Left side. Merrill swept the beam. At least 20 Japanese soldiers sat slumped against the walls dead, some from blast wounds, others from self-inflicted shots. One officer still held his sidearm, his wrist bone visible through torn flesh. Damn, Ortega murmured. They killed themselves. Not all of them, Harker said. Behind the bodies was a deeper tunnel, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Footprints. Fresh. They went back there, Harker said. Merrill's jaw tightened. All right. Dalton, give me a charge small enough to collapse a crawl space. Dalton hesitated. Sir, could be civilians hiding deeper. Hard to tell. Merrill clenched his teeth. Damn it. He wasn't wrong. The Japanese mixed families and soldiers deliberately. A man could spend 5 minutes clearing a tunnel before realizing the person he'd shot was a woman trying to shield her children. Okay, Merrill said finally. We call again. He shouted Japanese phrases into the dark. No response. He tried again. Nothing. Dalton set the charge. 10 seconds later, the earth groaned. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The tunnel collapsed in on itself with a heavy, final thud. The Marines stared at the rubble. We check the next one, Merrill said quietly. They turned and left. No one spoke for several minutes. By late afternoon, the platoon reached the northern cliffs, sheer drops hundreds of feet down to the ocean. The wind carried the salty scent of waves crashing far below. This was where, the intelligence report said, scores of civilians and soldiers had fled after the Banzai charge failed. Harker saw movement near the edge figures climbing out from bushes, from crevices, from holes in the cliffside. Then he heard the first scream. A Japanese woman ran toward the cliff, with a baby in her arms. No, no! Merrill shouted, sprinting after her. But she didn't hear him, or wouldn't. She kept running. Merrill was 20 feet away when she reached the edge. Harker couldn't breathe. She stepped off. Merrill staggered to a stop, hands gripping his hair. God damn it, he whispered. Another family approached the cliff, then another. Some Marines tried shouting in broken Japanese, some tried stepping in front of them, some begged. It didn't matter. The rumors the Japanese military had spread lies about torture, mutilation, rape ran deeper than any voice shouting at them in American uniforms. Harker had known this might happen. He'd read reports of civilians jumping from cliffs on other islands. But seeing mothers carrying infants, fathers holding hands with their children as they stepped into empty air, shattered something inside him. Ortega wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "We can't let them. We can't stop them," Harker said hoarsely. Merrill bent down, grabbed a dropped note from the ground, a paper scrap with Japanese characters scribbled on it. "Better to die together than live as ghosts under foreign rule." Merrill translated softly. He crushed it in his fist. At dusk, they reached one final cave larger than the rest, with black ash smeared around the entrance, as if a fire had burned for hours. "Might be the command post," Merrill said. Eyes open, they entered slowly. The cave split into two tunnels. The left path wound up toward a ledge. The right disappeared into heavy darkness. "Ortega." "Harker, take the right," Merrill said. "I'll clear the left with Dalton." Harker nodded and stepped into the dark. The tunnel widened into a large chamber. Something moved. Harker swung his rifle up. A flashlight beam flickered on, and Harker froze. A Japanese soldier, young, no more than 20, knelt in the center of the chamber. His right arm was broken, his uniform torn, his rifle tossed aside. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a white cloth. He looked up at Harker with trembling eyes, then bowed. Deeply. Ortega whispered, "Holy hell." "He's surrendering." The young soldier placed the cloth on the ground, pressed his forehead to the dirt, then waited. Harker lowered his rifle slightly. It was the first time in 3 years of war he'd seen a Japanese soldier surrender without a trick, without a grenade hidden behind his back, without waiting for a moment to pounce. "Easy," Harker said softly. "Easy." He stepped forward. The soldier didn't move. For a moment, silence filled the cave, a moment that felt like the first sliver of peace Saipan had seen in days. "Harker," Merrill called from the other tunnel. "You good down there?" "Yeah, sir. One alive. Surrendering." Merrill entered the chamber, looked at the young soldier, and nodded slowly. "Take him. Outside," he said. "Treat his wounds. He's done fighting." Harker helped the soldier to his feet. The young man winced in pain but bowed again. Ortega muttered, "1 out of 10,000. Guess Mercy's still alive somewhere." Harker didn't answer, but a small, exhausted smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. By the time the platoon regrouped on the ridge, night had fallen over Saipan. Fires burned in the distance. Artillery lit the horizon with intermittent flashes. The air trembled with the echoes of explosions from other sectors still fighting. But for Harker, Ortega, and Merrill, the day was over. They sat near their foxhole from the night before, the ground still scuffed and torn from the battle. Merrill took out a canteen and passed it around. "Hell of a day." "No kidding," Ortega said. Harker leaned back, staring at the stars emerging over the Pacific. "You ever think," he murmured, "that someday all this is going to be in a book, and some kids going to read it and think we were heroes?" Merrill shrugged. "We're not heroes. We're survivors. There's a difference." "Maybe," Harker said. "But sometimes surviving is the miracle." The 3 men sat in silence for a long time, listening to the distant war. Somewhere far behind them, the captured Japanese soldier slept under a tent, his broken arm splintered, his wounds bandaged. Alive, safe, spared. It wasn't much, but it was something. Saipan was still bleeding, still burning, still screaming in pockets of resistance. But for the first time since dawn, the first time since the Banzai wave swept across the ridge, Harker felt a small, fragile thread of hope. He didn't know how many more days the battle would last. He didn't know how many more caves they'd have to clear. He didn't know whether he himself would survive the war. But he knew one thing. Today, the mountain woke, Tomorrow, they would climb it again. Up next, you've got 2 more. Standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.